Section 60 of The Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ed Damerow. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. The Resuscitated. Touching was the scene in the bedchamber at the house in Red Lion Street. That scene which the return of the Earl of Ellingham, accompanied by Mr. de Medina, was to render more touching still. But previously to their arrival, the group was interesting and must be specially noticed. Rainford was seated in the bed, propped up with the pillows, for he still felt very weak, though all danger had completely passed. Standing by his side, with one hand locked in his, was Tamar, clad in deep mourning, a mourning now no longer necessary, and which covered a heart beating with ineffable joy. Dr. Lascelles and Esther de Medina were also standing close by the bed, and Jacob Smith was leaning over the footboard, surveying Rainford with eyes dimmed by tears, and in a kind of wonderment, as if he were scarcely able to convince himself of the miracle, the living evidence of which was before him. The hearts of all were too full for connected discourse, for even the doctor himself was more moved by the incidents in which he had that day performed so prominent a part than ever he had felt before. At length Tamar turned towards her sister and said in a low, tremulous tune, "Do you think, dear Esther, that Lord Ellingham will succeed? Can you hope it?" "I have every hope," replied Esther firmly. "His lordship suggested a plan by which all our father's scruples may be overcome." "And by which we shall not be separated, save for a few days, Tamar," observed Rainford. "I would not quit you even for an hour," answered the elder sister emphatically, "were it not that I was previously assured of being speedily reunited to you." Rainford pressed her hand tenderly. "If my friend Arthur does not succeed with Mr. de Medina," said Dr. Lascelles, "I must go myself and see what I can do. But I confess that I should despair of producing any effect, were Arthur's eloquence to fail." "Hark!" cried Jacob Smith, "the front door opens." The physician hastened to assure himself that no unwelcome step was approaching, and the sisters exchanged looks indicative of the most acute suspense. "Bravo!" cried the good doctor, returning in a few moments, and clapping his hands together. But before he had time to give any explanation as to the cause of a joy so unusual in one of his calm and unexcitable disposition, footsteps approached the room. The eyes of Rainford, the sisters, and Jacob Smith were anxiously cast towards the door. Lord Ellingham entered first, his countenance radiant with joy. Another moment, and Tamar bounded forward to meet her sire, in whose arms she was immediately received. "Oh, my dear, dear father!" exclaimed Tamar, "is it possible that you can forgive me, that this happiness is not a dream?" "Let the past be forgotten, my child," said Mr. de Medina, pressing her again and again to his breast. For now that she was forgiven, all the long-smothered generosity and tenderness of his heart in respect to her revived with fresh vigour. "And you, Esther, my well-beloved," he added, "come also and share your father's joy that the day of pardon has at length arrived." Most affecting was the scene. The physician pretended to be busily occupied in wiping his eye-glass, but the tears fell fast upon it. Rainford and Lord Ellingham both wept aloud, and Jacob Smith whimpered like a little child. At last the party grew somewhat composed, and Mr. de Medina advanced towards the bed. "Mr. Rainford," he said, extending his hand, which the resuscitated highwayman grasped with grateful warmth, "to you also do I say, let the past be forgotten. From the very bottom of my heart do I forgive you, and this forgiveness I the more readily accord, because I learn that your conduct has been uniformly kind and tender towards my daughter, because you are prepared to make her your wife according to the ritual of your creed, and also because I have heard from your noble relative, far more noble in nature even than in name, that you have manifested so many proofs of an excellent heart and a generous disposition towards him, that it is impossible not to admire your behavior in this respect. I have now said all that I intend to utter upon these subjects, for if I be stern and severe in my displeasure, I am equally sincere and profound in my forgiveness." "My dear Earl," whispered Dr. Lascelles, in the most solemn manner possible, and in a tone audible only to himself and the young nobleman, "I did not think of asking you for any reward for all I have this day done to serve you and yours. But I am so charmed with this Jew, who positively shows more good feeling than many Christians whom I know, that I would give anything to possess a cast of his head. Do you think—" "Depend upon it, my dear doctor, I will not forget your wish," said the Earl, smiling. "But you must admit that this is not precisely the time to ask a favour of so delicate a nature." "True," observed Lascelles, "and yet the interest of science—" "Hush!" said Lord Ellingham, "you will be overheard." As soon as the party were sufficiently composed to deliberate upon the course now to be adopted, considering the position of Rainford, a solemn conclave was held. The results of the council may be thus summed up. Dr. Lascelles, feeling convinced that Rainford was totally out of danger, proposed to return without delay to the West End, to visit his patients who would be otherwise astonished and vexed at his absence. Mr. de Medina was to repair home with his 2 daughters, and while the young ladies made all the necessary arrangements for the trip to France, their father undertook to proceed to Dover, and secure a sailing vessel to be in readiness by the time that Lord Ellingham and Rainford should reach that port. Mr. de Medina would then return to London to fetch his daughters, and the family would follow the half-brothers as speedily as possible to Paris. On his side, Lord Ellingham expressed his intention of remaining with Rainford until the moment for their departure together should arrive. Jacob Smith was to stay also in the house in Red Lion Street, and to accompany Tom Rain not only to France, but also to America, for the poor lad was so devotedly attached to him, and Rainford felt it almost a duty to remove the youth from the scene of his former temptations and miseries. Dr. Lascelles accordingly quitted the house, first having promised to see Rainford again next day. Mr. de Medina and his daughters next took their departure, Tamar having taken a tender farewell of him whom she loved, and whom, according to present arrangements, she was not to meet again until they arrived in Paris. As for Esther, ere she turned to quit the room, she gave her hand to Rainford, who respectfully touched it with his lips. At length, the Earl and Jacob were left together with the resuscitated highwayman, who now lost no time in narrating to them the particulars of his visit to that very house a few weeks previously. For when, on awakening from his deep sleep, he was sufficiently recovered to collect his scattered ideas, and when the first emotions attendant upon his meeting with Tamar had passed, he had recognized the chamber in which he was lying. But finding himself under the care and protection of Dr. Lascelles, whom he had seen, it will be remembered, in the house on the night of his memorable adventures beneath that roof, he had so far mastered his surprise and momentary alarm, so as to maintain a profound silence relative to his recognition of the place. But now there was leisure to converse on matters of secondary importance, and that she, in whose breast he was fearful of exciting fears for his safety, was no longer present, he detailed at full length all the particulars with which the reader is acquainted, not even omitting the impression existing in his mind that Old Death was no more. Then Lord Ellingham learnt how Rainford had happened to visit the laboratory when he was disturbed by the entrance of Lascelles, and he also heard for the first time how his half-brother had recovered his money with compound interest, and had obtained all the private papers proving the history of his birth and the marriage of the late Earl of Ellingham with Octavia Manners. Jacob, likewise for the first time, learnt that the very house in which he then was contained the storerooms of Old Death, and he now also ascertained the cause of that individual's sudden and mysterious disappearance. Arthur, in his turn, related the entire particulars of the outrage perpetrated upon him, his imprisonment in a dungeon for 4 long weeks, the reason of his writing the laconic letter which Rainford had received in prison, his escape by means of the sewers, and his suspicion, in consequence of all he had heard that morning from Dr. Lascelles, that the scene of his late incarceration was not altogether unconnected with the mysterious subterranean of that very house. But conjecture was useless in respect to all these circumstances, and the only point to which any positive decision could be arrived at was the absolute necessity that existed for defending the house from all intruders, so long as Rainford should remain in it. Jacob Smith went out to purchase refreshments, and Rainford felt himself so well that he was enabled to make a hearty meal. Hour after hour passed, and at length evening came. "Arthur," said Tom Rain, breaking a silence during which he had partially dozed, and now aroused by a sudden idea that had struck him, "Arthur, I have a strange fancy, a whim, which I must desire you would gratify." "Name it, Thomas," returned the nobleman. "I should like to see the evening paper," continued Tom Rain. "I need scarcely tell you that never again will the highways of this nor any other country be rendered dangerous by me. Never shall this right hand of mine perpetrate a crime. My career as a desperate plunderer terminated this morning on the roof of the jail. From the instant of my resuscitation, I date a new term of existence, new in a moral as well as in a physical sense. But I should like to see what is said of me in my last moments." For an instant the Earl hesitated, but only for an instant, and Jacob Smith was sent to purchase the evening newspaper. In due time he returned, and Rainford sat up in bed to read the account of his own execution. "I am glad of that," he exclaimed, as his eyes ran down the column headed with the awful words, "Execution of Thomas Rainford," and his countenance became flushed with excitement, as he read aloud, in a tone that trembled not in the least degree, a few of the sentences which seemed to give him pleasure. He underwent the dreadful process of pinioning with extraordinary courage. His footsteps were as firm as if anything save a scaffold were his destination. He ascended the stairs leading to the roof of the prison with steps that faltered not. The same dauntless courage sustained him as he mounted the fatal ladder which conducted him to the drop. Nor did he once exhibit signs of fear, no, not even when the executioner descended the platform to draw the bolt that was to launch him into eternity. Thus died a man who possessed a courage that would have rendered him distinguished had his destinies cast him in the profession of arms. "For heaven's sake, no more of this, my dear brother!" exclaimed the Earl, painfully excited. "Burn the paper, Arthur," said Tom Rain, handing it to the nobleman, and then throwing himself back on his pillow. "I have seen enough, and never wish to read that narrative again. But pardon me for having given you pain, and think not it was any frivolous sentiment of vanity that made me desirous to peruse the account, or that excited me as I read it. I merely wish to convince myself that no injustice was done me, Arthur," he added, very seriously, "for, of all things, I abominate a coward, and I confess it may be a weakness on my part that I should not like my last moments to have been misinterpreted. But let us talk no more on this topic, since it gives you pain. And now, by way of changing the conversation, I will tell you some of the plans I have shadowed out in my mind. Perhaps they may never be realized. I hope they may." Arthur had set fire to the newspaper by means of a lamp which was burning upon the table, and having crushed out the expiring flames with his foot, he drew his chair towards the bed to listen with attention to his half-brother. Jacob Smith leant over the footboard, anxious to drink in the words which Rainford was about to utter. "I have been thinking," resumed this individual, "that my past life requires a great atonement through the medium of my new existence. I am not, however, one of those men who turn saints, and who hope to win the good opinion of the world and the favour of heaven by means of incessant prayer. No, my ideas are quite at variance with such proceedings. I believe that one good deed is worth 10,000 psalms. It certainly is more beneficial to our fellow creatures, and must therefore be more acceptable to the Almighty. I have been thinking, then, how pleasant it would be for one who possesses an independence to employ his leisure time in seeking out those poor, unhappy beings whom adverse circumstances, or even their own faults, have plunged into misery. If they be cast down through misfortunes unconnected with ours, it would be delightful to aid them, but doubly pleasing must it be to reclaim those who have erred, and to afford even the felon a chance of quitting his evil ways and acquiring an honest livelihood." "Oh, it would indeed!" ejaculated Jacob Smith, all the adventures and incidents of his own checkered life rushing to his memory. "I have been reflecting, moreover, not merely within the last few moments," continued Rainford, "but ever since I heard the narrative of one who became an ill-doer in spite of himself," looking significantly for an instant towards the lad, "but who struggled successfully at last against temptation, cruel attempts at coercion, and almost unheard-of wretchedness. I have been reflecting, I say, that society is wrong in refraining from the adoption of strenuous means to reform those whom it considers to be the most abandoned. The reformist does not enter the criminal jail. He considers it to be useless. But whither should he go, if not there? He should reason with himself that it is impossible for men willingly to cling to the unnatural. The feverish excitement of a life of incessant crime, if they had any chance of adopting pursuits unattended with constant peril. Setting aside the morality of the case, 9/10 of those very persons who sing the loudest, swear the hardest, and appear the most depraved, would gladly quit a course that makes their conscience see a constable in every shadow. I think I can give you a parallel case, which will fully illustrate my meaning. It is the custom to vilify the Irish, to declare that they cling with a species of natural tenacity to their rags, their dirt, and their penury, to assert that they themselves are the foes to any civilizing principles which may be applied to them. But look at Irish labourers in England. Look at the Irishman when, in this country, supplied with plenty of work, earning adequate wages, and removed from scenes of political excitement. Does he not work hard? Is he indolent? Does he adhere lovingly to rags and misery? No such thing. Well, then, it is equally absurd to suppose that criminals cling with affection to crime, prisons, and an existence harassed by constant apprehensions. Remove the thief or the housebreaker from the sphere into which circumstances have cast him, and from which he cannot extricate himself. Give him a chance of earning an honest livelihood, and of redeeming his character, and in 9 cases out of 10 he may be reclaimed. There are, of course, exceptions to all rules, but I am convinced, from all I have seen and heard, that I am now speaking of a rule and not of the exceptions. Well, then, these considerations lead me back to the starting point which I chose. And I repeat my former words, that were some man to devote himself to the visitation not only of the dwellings of the honest poor, but also the haunts of crime and the abodes of vice, the deep sinks of impurity, and even the felons' jails themselves, he would be able to effect an immense amount of good. You may be surprised to hear such sentiments come from my lips. "I am delighted, ineffably delighted," exclaimed Lord Ellingham, speaking with the enthusiasm of unfeigned joy. and I agree with every opinion you have put forth. I see that our laws are miserably deficient, while they seek only to punish and not to reform; that our legislators are short-sighted, if not actually wicked, in neglecting to adopt means to prevent crime, by reforming the criminal, rather than encourage turpitude, by rendering the criminal a desperate outcast. "Oh, my dear brother," cried Tom Rain joyfully, "how happy I am to hear you thus express your adhesion to those theories which I have so rapidly glanced at. And are not you a legislator of England, an hereditary legislator? And do you owe nothing to your country? Believe me when I declare that were you to apply your intellect, your talents, your energies to this great question, you would render your name so illustrious that the latest posterity would mention it with veneration and gratitude. Rest well assured, Thomas, that these words of yours shall not be thrown away upon me," returned Arthur solemnly. "And on my side, humble individual that I am, and that I intend ever to remain," added Rainford, with a significant glance towards the Earl, "my resolution is fixed to make some atonement in another part of the world for all the bad deeds I have committed in this. Should I reach America in safety, it will be my task to reduce to practice some of these theories which I have just now broached, and I believe that the results will fulfill my expectations." Footnote: Mr. Brandon, in his admirable preface to Mr. Miles's work on Poverty, Mendicity, and Crime, places on record the ensuing observations. It is a generally admitted axiom that among the uneducated the human mind is more prone to evil than virtue. How greatly, then, must vice be disseminated and the evil propensities encouraged, by persons of all descriptions, from the hardened murderer to the truant-playing apprentice, mingling, and without one admonitory antidote to check them, all unemployed, all uneducated, in the proper school of morality. The idlers, tyros in crime, or petty misdemeanants, be they boys or adults, will listen with eager curiosity to the gossiping of the old and hardened offenders, while relating to each other the exploits they had achieved, or when giving instruction how to escape detection in certain situations which, from their own experience, they have been led to conceive the best, and to hear them plot fresh depredations to be committed as soon as they shall have finished the term of their captivity, or be set at large upon a verdict of not guilty. What but evil can arise from such a state of congregating? The mind cannot fail to become contaminated in some degree, even in the best disposed among them, while others, incited by the picture of pleasure they have described in the event of a successful enterprise, and from the encouragement given to the growing desires by the hardened wretches, enter recklessly into the path of vice as soon as they have turned their backs on the prison door. Future accomplices and companions of the jailbird, who had been their tutor, commencing their career perhaps by a robbery planned whilst in prison. Minds not overstrong nor sufficiently guarded by moral education are easily led astray, and the very punishment they are enduring as a requital for faults committed will be used as the rudder by which they are steered to crime, in persuading them that they are aggrieved victims instead of criminals, paying the penalty due to offended justice. This is the certain effect of the present system, and to expect anything like repentance or thorough reform in a criminal would be ridiculous. In a work published some time since, which is generally considered authentic, the autobiography of James Hardy Vaux, a notorious thief, is the following anecdote, which, as it corroborates and is illustrative of the facts above stated, namely that vice is taught in prison, is here inserted. He, Vaux, had in a most systematic manner robbed jewelers' shops, and, as he conceived, every one of note had fallen under his lash. He was at length taken up for stealing a gold snuff-box, and committed to Newgate, where he made acquaintance with two brothers, both of the same profession as his own, and committed for a similar offence. They were very communicative to each other, and Vaux discovered that there were some of his favourite shops which had escaped his notice. They pointed out, says the text, about a half-dozen shops which it appeared I had omitted to visit, arising either from their making no display of their goods, or from their being situated in private streets where I had no idea of finding such trades. Although I had little hopes of acquittal, it was agreed that in the event of my being so fortunate that I should visit these tradesmen I had overlooked, and I promised, in case I was successful, to make them a pecuniary acknowledgment in return for their information. He was further instructed in what manner to proceed, and what sort of goods to order, and a Mr. Belger, a first-rate jeweller in Piccadilly, was particularly recommended to his notice as a good fiat. He succeeded in getting acquitted, and in robbing the shops pointed out to his notice, when, like a man of honour, he did not fail to perform his promise to the two brothers, his associates in Newgate. The good fiat he robbed more than once, and once too often, for Vaux was discovered by him at last, and through his instrumentality convicted. End footnote. There is no doubt of it. Oh, there is no doubt, exclaimed Jacob Smith, catching the enthusiasm which now animated him who was once, and so lately, a lawless highwayman, but whom circumstances, and the never altogether crushed sentiments of a rightly constituted mind, had suddenly imbued with the hope of atoning for the past, by means of the good which he meditated towards his fellow creatures. Poverty is a fertile source of crime, observed Lord Ellingham, but then it is declared that many are poor only through their own idleness. How are such persons to be reformed? I am prepared to answer the question. Education will teach them the value of industry, and the necessity of rendering themselves independent of parochial relief and eleemosynary assistance. If a child offend, we say, he knows no better. The uneducated individual is as ignorant of the real principles of right and wrong as the lisping child, and therefore must instruction, not merely religious, but an enlightened species of education, be provided for the millions. Footnote. Mr. Brandon has these remarks in his preface just quoted from. Poverty is one of the great causes, and proceeds from both public and private abuse. It is the originator of minor crime, when it arises from want of employment commensurate to earn sufficient to maintain a large and growing family, so often to be found in the hovels of the poor; of the greater offences, when it is owing to idleness, and a total dislike to labour, of which there are but too many instances, the individuals never attempting to work more days than will procure food, and of that a scant portion for the family, while for their particular self they make up the deficiency by a quantity of those pernicious spirits so destructive to health, and become besotted the rest of their time, until they are compelled to labour for a supply of provision. At length work fails altogether, either from a slackness in trade, or the party having become too enfeebled or besotted to use proper care and exertion. Then, with poverty staring him in the face, his favourite liquor refused, and he turned out of the same house in which he had squandered so much, when flushed with cash, he becomes half mad, the inflamed state of his mind from drink adding to it, and the wretches he had associated with in his boozing hours, being of the worst description, giving bad advice, he is tempted and fails. But there are others who struggle in vain, and can only get a partial employ at most, who strive to their utmost, they cannot gain sufficient to drive the gaunt wolf, famine. From the door, and are doomed to behold the wife and children of their love, dearer to them than life, in a state of starvation. What wonder that they should be induced to steal food, to soften the cravings of hunger, and alleviate the bitter cries of the young and helpless infants. Parental affection is strong, and what for himself a man would score to do for the sake of his poor and suffering child, he rushes to, and rather than behold his family dying in the agony of starvation, he begins by robbing victuals. For this he is placed in prison with a set of reckless vagabonds, by whom he is taught to become as degraded as themselves, and crime following crime, he stops not till he rises to the acme of his profession. Whereas, if this description of prisoners had been kept apart, he would have returned to society nothing the worse for his incarceration. Early marriages are one of the great causes of poverty, a folly to which the laboring classes are greatly addicted, getting large families before they are enabled by their strength or abilities to maintain them. Dr. Granville made a very curious table, showing the ages at which they marry, and as his calculation is made upon his lying in hospital practice, which is confined to the lower classes, none else taking the benefit of such institutions, it is confirmatory of the fact and the extent of this evil. End footnote. It is for you to urge those great and glorious points in the proper place, in the Parliament of England, said Rainford, and I repeat, posterity will honour your name. I am not such a hypocrite as to deny the existence of those charms which a laudable ambition possesses, returned Arthur. No selfish considerations will, however, influence me in the public course which I am now determined to adopt. But I am forgetting, dear Thomas, that this prolonged discourse on an exciting topic may be prejudicial to you, weak and enfeebled as you are. Let us not, therefore, pursue the theme at present. It is now growing late, and you stand in need of repose. Jacob and myself will watch by your bedside. Rainford pressed his brother's hand, and composed himself to woo the advance of slumber. In about 10 minutes he was fast asleep. The Earl of Ellingham was seated close by the head of the bed. Jacob drew a stool near the foot, and the two observed a profound silence. The Earl looked at his watch. It was 10:30 o'clock. The lamp burnt upon the table. Suddenly slow and heavy steps were heard beneath, as if someone were ascending the flight of stairs under the floor. Lord Ellingham placed his finger upon his lips to enjoin Jacob to maintain the strictest silence, and then instantly extinguished the light. In another moment someone was heard preparing to raise the trap-door, a proceeding which Arthur did not attempt to thwart. He knew that if the person or persons now approaching were debarred the ingress which was sought, the front door would be the alternative next essayed, and he therefore resolved that, come what might, he would endeavour to capture and secure any intruders whose presence threatened in any way to interfere with his plans. These calculations were all weighed in a single moment by the energetic and brave young nobleman. The trap-door was raised slowly. The carpet was thrust aside from the aperture by the arm of him who was ascending, and a light suddenly gleamed from beneath. The intruder carried a lamp in his hand. Arthur and Jacob Smith maintained the most death-like silence, the former nerved for the trying scene, the latter ready to sink with apprehension on account of Rainford, who still slept soundly. Having removed the carpet from the aperture, a task which occupied nearly a minute, as the intruder held the lamp in his left hand and was compelled to support the trap-door in a half-open position with his head or back, while he worked with the right hand, the individual, for Lord Ellingham was by this time pretty well satisfied that only one person was approaching, prepared to ascend into the room. But the moment he removed the carpet, and advanced another step or two upwards, the lamp was dashed from his hand, and he was violently seized by the collar in the powerful grasp of Lord Ellingham, who exclaimed at the same instant, "Be silent, or you are a dead man." The individual thus captured uttered a low growl, but said nothing. Then, quick as thought, and with a degree of strength which astonished even him who exercised it, the Earl dragged the man up the steps into the room, but fortunately without awaking the soundly sleeping Rainford. All this took place amidst the most profound darkness, be it remembered, but acting with wonderful energy and presence of mind, Arthur dragged the man along the floor of the bedchamber into the laboratory, and then, without relaxing his hold, exclaimed, "Jacob, light the lamp and bring it hither." "Jacob," muttered the prostrate intruder, "Jacob!" "Silence!" cried the Earl. "You are in the grasp of a desperate man," he added in a menacing tone. "But if you mean no harm, you will receive no injury." Scarcely were these words uttered, when Jacob Smith, having hastily relighted the lamp, entered the laboratory, closing the door behind him, for he fully comprehended the Earl's motive in dragging the man, whoever he might be, away in the dark from the chamber where Rainford was lying. But hardly had the light of the lamp fallen upon the countenance of the individual who was now half lying, half sitting on the floor, restrained by the vigorous grasp of Lord Ellingham, who bent over him, when Jacob uttered a cry of mingled horror and alarm, exclaiming, as he staggered back, "'Tis Old Death!" The lamp fell from his hand and was instantly extinguished. Section 60.
Section 61 of The Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. The Jew's Family. In the meantime, Mr. de Medina had passed the happy afternoon in company with his 2 daughters and little Charlie Watts. Tamar acquainted her father and sister with the generous conduct of Rainford towards the boy, who was accordingly fetched by a servant from the lodging which he and his adopted mother had recently occupied in the city. Tom Rain's kindness in respect to Charlie made a deep impression upon Mr. de Medina, who had already heard and seen enough to convince him that the seducer of his daughter possessed many good qualities, especially a generosity of disposition which might have made the envy of a monarch. Charlie had been fortunately retained in complete ignorance of the real cause of the protracted absence of him whom he called by the endearing name of father. He was too young to entertain suspicions or misgivings on the subject, and the excuses which Tamar had constantly made to account for that absence had so far satisfied his mind that he entirely believed them, although he pined for the return of Rainford. When he beheld Tamar weep, which was often, very often, he exerted himself to console her, throwing his little arms round her neck, and yet weeping also. Even when Tamar, with the bitterest anguish, arrayed herself in deep black on the awful morning, the results of which she could not have possibly anticipated, she had not the heart to exchange Charlie's coloured garments for the mourning ones which had been prepared for him. No, she threw them aside. She had not strength sufficient to place before her own eyes an evidence of the dreadful loss which she deemed herself that hour to sustain. The dinner-table at Mr. de Medina's house that day was gayer, far more gay than usual, for a forgiven daughter sat at the board; and Charlie Watts was so happy to see his dear mamma smile once more, and to receive the positive assurance that he would meet his papa in a few days, that it was delightful to behold his sweet countenance animated with such heartfelt, innocent joy. The attendance of the servants was dispensed with, in order that the conversation might flow unreservedly, and Mr. de Medina felt the full amount of that pleasure which consists in pardoning, as Tamar expressed the ineffable happiness of being by a father pardoned. And Esther, beauteous, amiable, generous-hearted Esther, she was as gay and smiling as she was ever wont to be in her girlhood, ere Tamar's disgrace had carried sorrow into the heart of the family. In the evening, Mr. de Medina bade adieu to his daughters and little Charlie, and departed in a post-chaise for Dover, according to the arrangements already made. That night, when the sisters retired to rest, a touching scene occurred in Esther's chamber, for this amiable girl led Tamar to her drawers, in which she showed her all the music books and the pictures that had been so religiously preserved. Then Tamar threw herself, weeping with gratitude and joy, into Esther's arms, and delicious was the embrace of purest affection in which the sisters clasped each other. "Oh, how can I ever repay thee for so much love, dearest Esther?" murmured Tamar in a tone expressive of her unfeigned sincerity. "By thinking of me frequently when you are far away," replied Esther, the tears streaming from her eyes as she reflected that they were no sooner reunited than they were about to separate again, for a long, long period, perhaps for ever. "I shall never cease to think of thee, my Esther," answered the elder sister, as she now began to set at liberty the shining masses of her rich black hair, preparatory to retiring to rest. For she was to share Esther's bed, little Charlie being already asleep in an adjoining chamber, the door of communication being left open in case he might awake. "No, never shall I cease to think of thee, Esther," repeated Tamar, "for thou hast always manifested so much devoted affection towards me. And then, too," she added, casting down her blushing countenance, "thou hast endured so much for my sake." "Oh, have we not agreed that the past is to be forgotten?" hastily exclaimed Esther, for a moment desisting from the occupation of laying aside her garments. "The deeds that are gone should only engage our thoughts when no hope survives for the future. And how much hope is there yet for you?" she added, with an emphasis upon the pronoun. Tamar started, and gazed steadfastly upon her sister's countenance, for, apart from that emphasis which was not unnoticed, there seemed something mournful in the sweet, liquid tones of Esther's voice. "Hope for me!" exclaimed Tamar. "Yes, there is hope of happiness for me and for him whom I love so tenderly. But you spoke, my beloved sister, as if there were hope for me alone, and that there was none for you. Ah, Esther, have no secret from me, for I will never henceforth refuse you my fullest confidence in the letters which I shall address to you so often, so very often. Esther, my sweet sister, you love." The maiden buried her countenance in Tamar's bosom. "I am not deceived," continued the latter. "Yes, you love, Esther, and perhaps you are not loved in return. But tell me all, and I may counsel you." Esther murmured a name, and as she thus whisperingly pronounced it, her face was burning in its contact with Tamar's bosom, so deeply did she blush in the confusion and shame of that confession of virgin love. "The Lord of Ellingham!" cried Tamar, echoing the name which her sister had breathed. "Alas, yes," answered Esther, raising her beauteous countenance, still suffused with the rich carnation hues of modesty. "I can conceal the truth from my own heart no longer. But he loves another—" "Whom he can never marry," added Tamar, "and therefore, my beloved sister, there is hope for thee." "Can never marry Lady Hatfield?" exclaimed Esther in a tone of profound surprise. "Rainford assured me that such is the case," continued Tamar. "I am not aware of the reason, because he did not volunteer an explanation, and it never has been my habit to question him respecting affairs on which he has not spoken freely of his own accord. But this much I can assure you, that Lady Hatfield and the Earl of Ellingham will never be united, and that they no longer entertain even the idea of such union. Do not therefore perplex yourself relative to the cause of their severance, my darling Esther, but nourish hope, for oh, it is delicious to feel love upon the manner of hope. And believe me, the Earl of Ellingham already surveys you with so much admiration, already entertains so exalted an opinion of your character, already looks upon you with such respect, that he cannot fail to experience feelings more tender still." "Oh, Tamar, talk not thus! I may not listen to thee," exclaimed Esther, with fluttering heart and swelling bosom; for, model of purity and innocence as she was, the words of her sister excited pleasurable sensations within her breast. And thus ever is it with the most chaste, most virtuous, and most unsophisticated maiden who loves for the first time. Nay, do not compel me to keep silence on a topic which must be dear to your soul, my Esther," said Tamar. "Were human beings to feel shame at loving, there would not be an unblushing cheek in the whole world, save amongst children. Sooner or later, dear sister, every one must feel the influence of that passion which spares no one. Oh, cold and cheerless indeed would this world be, were not the hearts of those who have grown up, and who have cast aside the frivolities of childhood, warmed and irradiated by the beams of love. Feel not ashamed, then, dearest Esther, on account of this passion which has so imperceptibly stolen upon thee." "But after all you have said, Tamar," returned the coy and bashful maiden, "I shall not be able to meet the Earl again without blushing; and then, were I mad enough to indulge in such a hope as you would have me nourish, remember the difference of our creeds. Was it not the Earl himself who suggested the means by which matrimonial rites could be celebrated between his own half-brother and myself?" demanded Tamar, eagerly. "Yes," replied Esther, every feature of her fine aquiline countenance deriving additional charms from the crimson hues which mantled on that splendid face, and spread themselves over her arching neck, her gracefully sloping shoulders, and the rich contours of her virgin bust, which, in the presence of her sister, no invidious drapery now concealed. "Yes, Tamar," she replied; "but there are and far more important considerations. Consider how exalted is the rank of that great nobleman; and consider also," she added in a mournful tone, "how much our race is still despised even in this land, which boasts of an almost consummate civilization." "The Earl of Ellingham, I feel convinced, despises such absurd, such pitiful prejudices," said Tamar, labouring only to render her sister happy by means of joyous hope. "As an enlightened man, he must recognise how deeply his country is indebted, in respect to its wondrous prosperity, to the commercial enterprise and the financial skill of our nation. Moreover, do we not believe in the same God? For the Almighty whom the Christians worship is the same who brought our forefathers out of Egypt, and gave them the promised land. In a word, my beloved Esther, Arthur of Ellingham is too noble-minded a being to despise you because you cling to the creed in which you were brought up, and something tells me that my sister is destined to become the Countess of Ellingham." Esther sighed, but made no response. Tamar continued to discourse in the same inconsiderate strain for several minutes. She was actuated by the most generous motives towards her sister, but, in the enthusiasm of her affection and gratitude, she forgot that she might only be exciting hopes destined never to receive a fulfilment, and encouraging a passion which, after all, was perhaps doomed to experience the bitterness of disappointment. At length Esther turned towards her, and exclaimed hastily, "Tamar, if you love me, speak on this topic no more. It may be false shame on my part, but it seems to me that it is unmaidenly thus to discourse on a subject in which one who is separated from me by so wide a gulf is concerned. Alas! deeply do I regret that, in a moment of weakness, I emitted aloud that which my heart had not hitherto dared to whisper even to itself. I should have exercised more command over myself. Oh, I have been foolish, very foolish, to permit such a thought even to assume the faintest shape in my imagination. But we will abandon the topic. And again I say, Tamar, if you love me, renew it not." There was a minute's pause, at the expiration of which Esther began to converse gaily and rapidly on Tamar's future prospects in the clime to which it was contemplated that herself and Rainford were to proceed, and the amiable girl communicated to her sister all that she had read concerning the United States of North America. This little manoeuvre on the part of Esther was to change the topic of discourse, and Tamar did not attempt to renew a subject which offended the maiden pride of her sister. Oh, happy was Tamar to sleep beneath her father's roof that night, to know, to feel that she was in the parental dwelling again. When she awoke once, while it was yet dark, she fancied that she had been dreaming, so strange did all the incidents of the preceding day appear to be, so truly incredible. But, as she stretched out her arms, they encountered the form of her sister, and then, in the silence and obscurity of the night, Tamar joined her hands and prayed fervently, far more fervently than she had prayed for some years past. And, Christian, darest thou believe that the prayers of the despised Jewess were not wafted with thine own to the throne of the Eternal? End of section 61.
Section 62 of The Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anders from the city of Aarhus, Denmark. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3 by George W. M. Reynolds. Chapter 60. Sir Christopher Blunt's Domestic Hearth. It was the morning following the incident just related, and the scene changes to the house of Sir Christopher Blunt in Jermyn Street. The worthy knight and his lady were seated at breakfast. The table literally groaned beneath the weight of the cold viands placed upon it, for the ex-lady's maid was particularly addicted to good things, and she moreover thought that it was quite the rage to see cold fowls, ham, tongue, Perigord pie, and all kinds of marmalades spread for the morning repast. Lady Blunt was in her glory of premeditated negligence and studied dishabille. She was arrayed in a pea-green silk wrapper, trimmed all down the front with scarlet bows, and the cape was braided with the same glaring hue, so much affected by a certain lady of Babylon. Her cap was decorated with ribbons, likewise of scarlet, and she wore red slippers. Her appearance was indeed most flaming, as she lolled in delightful lassitude in capacious easy-chair, with her foot upon an ottoman. A stranger would have thought that so fine a lady could not possibly touch anything more substantial than a thin slice of toast or half a muffin for her breakfast. But she had in reality paid her respects, and with a good will also, to every dish upon the table. Sir Christopher was seated opposite to her, looking like a fish out of water. For in order to please his dear wife, or rather to have a little peace and quiet in the house, he had consented to adorn his person with a light blue dressing-gown, fastened by a gold cord and huge tassels at the waist, and a pair of bright red trousers, large and loose like a Dutchman's. Moreover, a scarlet silk cap, with a long gold tassel, was perched airily over his left ear, so that altogether he seemed as if he were dressed out to enact the part of a Turk at a masquerade. "Shall I cut you a little slice more ham, my love?" inquired Sir Christopher, in a mincing tone, as if he were afraid of receiving a box on the ears for not speaking civilly enough. "No, Sir Christopher," answered the lady sharply. "You shan't send me a little ham, as you call it. I don't like the ham, and that's flat." "And yet, my love, that is, my dear," remonstrated the knight gently. "And yet what?" demanded his wife. "I think I had the pleasure of helping you 3 times, my love," added Sir Christopher, astonished at his own boldness in uttering the words the moment they had escaped his lips. 3 times, ejaculated the lady, turning as red as her ribbons or as her husband's trousers. "And if I like to be helped 6 times, or 9 times, Sir Christopher, what would you say then?" "Well, my love, I should say—" "What should you say?" again asked the lady, assuming a menacing attitude. "Why, my love, that you had a very good appetite," responded the knight, looking as miserable as if he expected 8 fingernails to fasten on his cheeks the very next moment. "I have no appetite, Sir Christopher," cried the lady in a petulant tone as she sank back again into her lounging attitude. 3 miserable bits of ham and a trifle of cold pie, with maybe a taste of the chicken and just 1 cut of the tongue. "And 2 eggs, my love," suggested Sir Christopher meekly. "Well, and 2 tiny eggs," continued the lady. "I'm sure that all that doesn't say much for one's appetite." Why, when I was a lady at Hatfield's, I used to eat 3 great rounds of bread and butter, crustiness and all." "But you are no longer at Lady Hatfield's, my angel," said Sir Christopher, simpering. "You are with one who adores you, who has given you his name, a name, I flatter myself, that carries weight with it in certain quarters, although when I did so far forget myself as to put up for Portsoken." "Now, Sir Christopher, pray let us have none of that nonsense, if you please," interrupted Lady Blunt, in a tone and with a manner which showed that she knew full well she should be obeyed. "I can't bear to hear even the word Alderman mentioned, ever since a lady I lived with once in the city talked something about the Guildhall police court when she missed the silver spoons." My dear," said Sir Christopher, "you forget that you are now Lady Blunt. Pray, let us change the topic." "Well, so we will," she cried sharply, "and I'll tell you what we'll talk about." "What, my best love?" asked the knight. "Your best love," almost shrieked the lady. "Then you must have other lovers if I'm your best. Oh, Sir Christopher, was it to hear this that I gave up everything, all my prospects in life, to become yours?" "My dear girl," said the knight meekly, "I most humbly submit to you that I do not think you had so very much to give up when I asked you to become Lady Blunt." "What? Do you call a good place and being my own mistress nothing to give up?" cried Charlotte. 24 guineas a year and the chance of marrying a duke or prince." "Well, well, my love, we will not dispute," said the knight, who in his heart wished to God that she never had given up the prospect she spoke of, or that she had married some duke or prince, in which latter case Sir Christopher would not have envied either his grace or his royal highness after the trifling experience he had already enjoyed relative to the fair one's temper. "No, I should think you would not dispute either, Sir Christopher," cried the vixen, tossing her head. "But I was going to tell you what we would talk about when you interrupted me so rudely. I was going to say that I do not approve of that ham, or yet the chicken, or yet the tongue, and I do not mean to have my breakfast spoiled in this way. Ring the bell, Sir Christopher." "My dearest Charlotte." "Ring the bell, Sir Christopher," repeated the lady in a still more authoritative tone, as she looked daggers, nay, regular bayonets, at her miserable husband. The knight rang the bell accordingly, gulping down a sigh, a very profound sigh at the same time. A footman answered the summons. "John," said the mistress of the house. "Yes, my lady," was the reply. "Tell Mrs. Bodkin to step up immediately," added the wife of Sir Christopher's rash choice. "Yes, my lady," and the footman disappeared, thanking his stars that he was not in for it, the bad humour of his mistress being very evident indeed. In due time, Mrs. Bodkin made her appearance in the shape of a stout, matronly-looking female of a certain age, as a housekeeper ought to be. For Mrs. Bodkin was neither more nor less than high female functionary in the establishment. "Mrs. Bodkin," said Lady Blunt, endeavouring to distort her really pretty face into as stern an expression as possible. "Yes, my lady," returned the housekeeper. "That ham is detestable, Mrs. Bodkin. Indeed, my lady, the cold fowl is abominable. Sure now, my lady. And the tongue is frightful." "Lack-a-daisy, your ladyship don't say so." "I do say so, though, Mrs. Bodkin," cried Sir Christopher's better half. "And I just tell you what it is. I don't mean to have my breakfast spoiled in this way. And if you can't find tradesmen who'll supply good things—" "Why, please, your ladyship," interrupted the housekeeper, quite astounded at these accusations against comestibles, which she knew to be excellent. "Mr. Smuggs, who sent in the ham and tongue, is purveyor to his Majesty. And then if his Majesty chooses to put up with Mr. Smuggs' rubbish, Lady Blunt will not," exclaimed the mistress of the house, glancing indignantly first at the petrified Mrs. Bodkin, and then at the dumbfounded Sir Christopher. There was, as romancists say, an awful pause. Mrs. Bodkin knew not whether she was standing on her head or her heels. Sir Christopher was in an equally strange state of bewilderment as to whether he had heard aright or was labouring under a delusion, and Lady Blunt was triumphant in the impression she had evidently made upon her audience. "But my dear angel, my love," at length stammered the knight, "surely you will not, that is, you cannot. I appeal to you, my sweet, as a woman of sound judgment." "Sound fiddlestick, Sir Christopher," interrupted her ladyship contemptuously. "I know what I'm saying, and I mean what I say. Mrs. Bodkin, I order you once for all not to deal no more at Smug's. And if you can't choose good things, you better pack up your things and go about your business." Now it happened that Mrs. Bodkin had managed, during long years of servitude and by rigid economy, to scrape together a very comfortable independence, and, feeling that she was independent, she did not choose, as she afterwards observed to a friend, to put up with any of Mrs. Nonsense. "Go about my business, eh?" she accordingly exclaimed. "Well, ma'am, the sooner I do that, the better, I think. For since I can't give satisfaction here, I'd much rather resign at once." "Resign?" echoed Lady Blunt, again turning red as her ribbons. "Yes, ma'am," continued the housekeeper. "Resign, I said, and you ought to know that's the right word, for I believe you wasn't always used to sit in the parlour." "Oh, you wretch!" exclaimed Lady Blunt, now manifesting a violent inclination to go off into hysterics. "Sir Christopher, can you sit there and hear me insulted by that audacious woman? Turn her out of the house, Sir Christopher. Let her bundle, neck and crop, this minute." "I rather think there's no need for bundling in the matter," said the indignant Mrs. Bodkin. "Sir Christopher is too much of a gentleman to ill-treat me, after being 11 years in his service come next April. But I don't require no favours at your hands, ma'am. Leastways, I wouldn't accept them if they was offered." And in a most stately manner Mrs. Bodkin walked out of the room, leaving the door wide open behind her. "Sir Christopher!" exclaimed Lady Blunt, bursting into tears, but tears of rage and not shame. "Yes, my love," said the knight, who was rendered so nervous by this scene that he appeared to be labouring under incipient delirium tremens. "You're a brute, Sir Christopher," cried the angel in the pea-green wrapper and the red bows. My dear, my love," stammered the knight, "it was not my fault. You brought it on yourself. I really think—" "Oh, I did I?" screeched Charlotte, and unable to control the fury of her passion, she darted upon Sir Christopher, adown whose cheeks the marks of her nails were in another moment rendered most disagreeably visible. "Lady Blunt!" vociferated the miserable man, struggling to extricate himself from the power of the fury. "There, now I've taught you not to nag me on another time," said Charlotte, throwing herself back into her chair, already sorry and ashamed for what she had done, but too deeply imbued with vulgar and mean-spirited pride to manifest the least proof of such compunction. Sir Christopher wiped his bleeding face with his cambric pocket-handkerchief, but his heart was too full to speak. He felt all the indignity which he had just sustained, and yet he had not courage enough to resent it. The embarrassment of the newly married pair was relieved, or rather interrupted, by a loud and unusually long double knock, which at that moment awoke every echo, not only in the house itself, but also halfway up Jermyn Street. A few minutes elapsed, and then the footman entered the breakfast parlour to announce to Sir Christopher that a gentleman who had been shown into the drawing-room wished to speak to him immediately upon most urgent business. At the same time the servant placed upon the table a card bearing the name of Captain O'Blunderbuss. "Tell the gentleman I'll be with him in a moment, John," said Sir Christopher. The servant bowed and retired. "Do you know who he is?" asked Lady Blunt. "No, I do not," responded the knight, more sulkily than he had ever yet dared to speak to his wife. "Come now, Sir Christopher," exclaimed her ladyship, "don't have any of your ill humours with me, because I can't bear them. Say you're sorry for what you've done, and I'll not only forgive you, but also patch your face for you with diachylon plaster. Come now, do what I tell you." And as her ladyship seemed to examine her fingernails as she spoke, in a manner which portended her readiness to make another onslaught, the miserable husband muttered a few words of abject apology for an offence which he had not committed, and the amiable Charlotte vouchsafed a pardon which she should rather have besought than bestowed. Then there was a little fond, or rather foolish kissing and hugging, and this farce being concluded, the lady hastened to fulfill her promise relative to the diachylon plaster. When this operation was likewise ended, Sir Christopher cast a rueful glance into the looking-glass over the mantel, and never did a more miserable wight see reflected a more woefully patched countenance. The wretchedness depicted on that face, apart from the long slips of plaster stuck upon the cheeks, contrasted in a most ludicrous fashion with the absurd splendor of the knight's morning attire. And to use a common phrase, he wished himself at the devil as he wended his mournful way to the drawing-room. End of chapter 62.